Hello, everyone. Welcome to your first session of Track 2, Program Management SRAE Alignment. My name is Megan Yarber from Public Strategies, and I'll be the host for today's session. I'd like to review just an additional couple of housekeeping items here and remind you that to use the chat feature, please select the chat box and you can ask questions, make comments, and address any technical issues you might have. Please be sure to select the drop-down to everyone option so that the moderators and presenters can see all of your questions and comments. As a note, this presentation will be recorded. Recording, presentations, and handouts will be available on the Exchange after the topical training has concluded. At this time, I would like to welcome today's moderator, Jerry Regier, Project Director with Public Strategies.
Thank you, Megan, and good afternoon, everyone. Let me also just mention there is a handout, one handout for this session that there's a downloadable button on your sheet that you would have gotten with all the Zoom links, etc. So you can download that handout on your own. So today we'll be hearing from first Valerie Huber, and Valerie is a longtime person who has run the SRAE programs in the state of Ohio, and then was the founding president of Ascend, and now is at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services as a special representative for global women's health. Valerie will begin, and then Marianne Mozak will take the last half of the session. She is the president and CEO of Ascend, formerly the executive director of a local SRAE program, Operation Keepsake, in Cleveland. So, Valerie.
Thank you, Jerry, and good afternoon, everyone. We're really excited to present today's session. I want to first review what the objectives are that are before you. First of all, it's to examine the background and legislative intent of sexual risk avoidance education within the context of an optimal health model. And then second, to recognize the importance of ensuring program fidelity and grant compliance through organizational alignment with the goals and objectives of SRAE and proper training of program staff and facilitators on the purpose, components, and required topics A through F to be taught in SRAE. Next slide, please. So today, I'm going to share with you the legislative background for SRAE. First of all, I think it's really important to kind of look inside the head of Congress and those who were instrumental in launching the SRAE program. And really, it helps to understand the intent behind this program, which I think you'll find insightful as you implement this program in your own communities. Congress wanted to ensure that youth would receive the tools that they needed to equip them so that they could successfully navigate both their adolescence and then thrive into adulthood. This program was designed to leave no one behind, offering reinforcement, offering hope for every student, no matter their story. Congress was very deliberate about this. They were motivated. And what we're going to share today is the background that led to SRA education funding within the appropriations bill in 2016. So right off the bat, the first thing foremost for Congress was to begin a discussion about youth and what kind of program would help facilitate their thriving and their health. Next slide, please. So the second thing that was really paramount in crafting this new legislation was to look at the trends for youth risk behavior and what those trends looked like over the years. Next slide, please. So if you look at this slide, you'll notice some surprising data here. The far left shows the percentage of high school students who had ever had sex in 1991. More than half had. But you can see a downward trajectory from 1991 to 2007 to 2017, where now you have under 40% of high school students who have ever had sex. Next slide, please. It's also important to know when they began having sex. And in 1991, when the CDC began tracking this data, 10% of youth began having sex under the age of 13, and we know that's highly problematic for a number of reasons. But when you look at today, there's been a 33% decrease, where now we only have 3.4% of youth initiating sex before the age of 13. Now, is that too high? Of course it's too high, but it is greatly decreased from when this first initiated and when the CDC began tracking this in the Youth Risk Behavior Survey. Next slide, please. And all of this data is from YRBS, the Youth Risk Behavior Survey. Another important thing when we're looking at youth risk to consider is, what are the trends regarding how many sexual partners those students are having? Because we know age of initiation is important, but so is the number of sexual partners when we're assessing what kind of risk these youth are engaging in. There's been almost a 50% drop in 4 or more partners, which is how YRBS looks at partners. In 1991, almost 19% of those high school youth had 4 or more partners, but in 2017, it's under 10%. This is dramatic. This is significant. Next slide, please. So when the CDC defines current sexual activity, they're actually looking at 3 months, within the past 3 months, has that young person engaged in sexual activity. In 1991, it was 37.5% who were currently sexually active. Since then, we see now that there's been about a 25% drop, where it's just under 29%. Again, this is significant. So if you're looking at the smaller percentage, definite minority of high school students who have ever had sex, then the subset of that are those who are currently sexually active, and we're looking at under 1 in 3. Next slide, please. So looking at that trend data was really important because members of Congress, just like most Americans, would just assume that most teens are sexually active. That's kind of the mantra that you read, and it's almost an expectation in this general conversation. So when members of Congress learned that not only were the majority of youth not sexually active, that the majority of high school students were making increasingly healthier decisions regarding sexual decision-making, this just fortified their desire to ensure that they were receiving reinforcement for those healthy decisions. But there was another component as well, and this is the deliberate discussion about how public policy should reflect public health priorities. What do we mean by that? Let's look at the next slide, and it gives a little bit further information. So Dr. Foley is going to take a deep dive into the optimal health approach, which is being used here actually at HHS in both practical ways and in health paradigm affirming ways. But let me provide just a very quick intro, because I think it's really important for us to recognize that when Congress passed this legislation, this was an important component in the creation of the SRAE funding. There is a very firm footing on making this a public health priority centered on best health outcomes for youth. And if you look at this particular quote here, by by really the foremost expert on optimal health, you can see some things that are really standing out. And let me just read this quote, and then let's point out a few important pieces of it. Optimal health is a dynamic balance of physical, emotional, social, spiritual, and intellectual health. So put that all together, and we're really talking about a holistic approach to health outcomes. Lifestyle change can be facilitated through a combination of learning experiences that enhance awareness, increase motivation, and build skills, and most important, through the creation of opportunities that open access to environments that make positive health practices the easiest choice. So there are some other really important components in this definition. Secondly, in addition for this to be a holistic approach, we're also looking at the importance of both providing information, building skills, then providing motivation to choose those healthy choices, and then opportunities to practice those healthy behaviors. Why? Well, that last phrase says why, and it's really in order to make it easier to make healthy choices. So look at the model to the right of that definition, and you'll see that this target is color-coded for a very specific reason. The target for an optimal health model is to reinforce healthy decisions and help move those who are either engaging in low risk or high risk behaviors to move closer and closer to no risk. And success then is measured by the degree of movement away from risk, not just merely moving from high risk to low risk, not stopping there, but continuing to provide skill building, information, motivation, and opportunities to make healthier and healthier choices as time goes by. Next slide, please. So after Congress considered those important pieces, then they also wondered, well, what does taxpayer dollars currently look like for sex education approaches? And it was interesting because a few years prior to this legislation being implemented, HHS conducted an analysis of funding between the different approaches for sex education. Next slide, please. So in 2008, there was a funding comparison conducted by HHS, and it was divided into several pots, but just to make it very simple in this particular graph, I made the comparison between funding for specific SRA programs and those that are not specifically SRA. And you can see that in 2008, nearly 80% of all sex ed programs were devoted to those that did not focus specifically on sexual risk avoidance, and only 22% that did. Now, it's important to note that in 2008, this was at the high point for funding for what was called then abstinence education. And even then, there was a huge disparity. So Congress looked at that, and again, it was surprising to them to see this huge disparity. Next slide, please. Well, based on those estimates that were, or based on that analysis that was conducted in 2008, Congress looked at what those funds probably looked like before implementing the program, but there was some uncertainty. What we knew for sure is that even in 2007, when we were at the high point for SRA funding, there was a huge disparity. This administration updated that funding comparison, and you can see here that in 2017, things really haven't changed that much. 11% of all sex ed funding is devoted to sexual risk avoidance education, and nearly 90% to programs that are not sexual risk avoidance programs. And I want to make a caveat to make sure that all listeners recognize that this is funding solely for adolescent sex ed programs. This is not for pregnancy prevention for adults or for any other age group other than those who would fall within the adolescent category. Next slide, please. So what's I'd like you to see here, kind of as an aside, is that when you compare 2016, 2017, 2020 funding, there has been an increase in SRA funding. However, the overall comparison for sex ed has changed very little in the last decade and even further. Next slide, please. So just to sum this up, Congress was not trying to make an ideological statement in introducing the sexual risk avoidance education program. They were focusing first on youth thriving, holistic, healthy habits, skills for life, not just to help them navigate through adolescence, but to improve and increase their opportunities to thrive into adulthood. Secondly, they put science and health over ideology. They looked at the optimal health approach. They looked at the public health paradigm and how we address other risk behaviors. And they thought it was high time that for sex education, that same paradigm was adopted for youth. And then finally, they recognized that the SRAE program would help move the needle a little bit closer to parity in funding between the sex ed approaches. Put that all together and you can understand that there were several intents behind this SRA funding, but all of them were based on research, facts, and what would best help young people make healthy decisions, continue to make healthier decisions, make healthier decisions than they did the day before, and also give them the permission and the skills to think differently about their today, their health, and what's possible for tomorrow. Well, Marianne is going to unpack how these broad principles then were expressed in the legislation. And Marianne, I'm going to turn it over to you to do that.
Okay, well, thank you. And we can go right to the next slide. Hello, everyone. It's really an honor to be with you. And thank you, Valerie, for giving us the background there regarding public policy and funding and health considerations. So what was you know, in the mind of Congress as they created SRA education? And I'm going to, you know, continue that discussion, and I'm going to talk about the topics and the components that are required for the legislation. And that's why I hope that when we talk about those components and topics, you'll see the holistic nature of SRA education and why we say that sex is always about more than sex, right? You can't be really talking about teen sex without talking about life impact and the very many areas in a person's life that sexual decisions can impact. So we're going to do that. Before we dive in, though, I'd like to ask our host to launch a very simple poll. It's a yes or no, and I would encourage you to, you know, answer if you could. So, Megan, if you could launch the first question as a poll.
Could we ask for yes or no responses using the chat box?
Yes. You know what, Megan, I think in the interest of time, since it is a simple question, we'll why don't we just dive into the presentation, because we want to give enough time for questions and answers. So let's just go right to the next slide. So this is a picture actually of somebody, of the landing on the moon, and you're probably wondering, why am I talking about this great event? We actually celebrated the 50th year of putting a man on the moon. And so this was in 2018, and I was reading about the team that actually accomplished this. And I found out that there were 400,000 people who worked for 7 years to put a man on the moon. And when you looked at the background of what they were looking for in the scientists and the researchers and the engineers in particularly, they emphasized the fact that everybody on the team had to know what the goal and the objectives of the mission really was. And I thought there were some parallels there, because in addition to knowing the goals and objectives, they also asked people about whether or not they thought this project was doable. Did they believe that we could actually land a man on the moon? And that actually factored in to whether or not they were going to be hired for this particular assignment. And in the previous session, in track 2 there in our joint session, I was really struck by Leah saying that that's exactly what they do when they try to look at, who they're hiring. What do you believe about youth? So I thought there were some parallels there. So I just wanted to say that is a very important aspect of SRA education. Let's go to the next slide, and we'll see that, looking at a successful implementation, we will have to really be keying in on program fidelity and grant compliance. And we'll find that in the legislation. And typically what we know is that the grant writer or the program manager may intimately know all of the criteria that's put forth in the legislation. But we would encourage you, if you are a program director, to make sure that your facilitators also know what is required according to the Congress and for this particular funding stream. Because your facilitator is really the frontline delivery system that will implement program fidelity and be grant compliant. So let's go to the next slide and look at exactly what is being talked about in the legislation. Sometimes I think it's better to just really read the legislation right, straight from how it was written. So Congress amended Section 510 of the Social Security Act in fiscal year 2018 to enable territories or other entities to implement education exclusively on sexual risk avoidance. And I took the liberty of highlighting the word exclusively. And the reason for that is because one of the things we want to underscore is that legislative language is very intentional. And it has to be so, because legislative language, Congress wants language to be precise so that their intent is accurately communicated for why certain money is being appropriated. All right, so what does exclusively mean here? Well, it actually means that this is not funding for PrEP, Personal Responsibility Education Program, or for any other sexual risk reduction program. It has different goals and objectives. And so when we're looking at risk reduction approach or a risk reduction approach or a risk elimination approach, they are different. In a risk elimination approach, as Valerie said, we're basing that on an optimal health model where we are normalizing sexual delay. We are always attempting to move youth away from risk to a no risk status. And we are emphasizing that marriage is the best context for sex. So there's a reason why we have different funding streams. So this is the SRAE program, and this is kind of the, if I had to make a summary of what it is and what its purpose is, this particular exclusivity defines it. So next slide, please. All right, so I'm going to look at the components, and I apologize, I have to talk fast here because there are a lot of topics and a lot of components, and I won't be able to give, do justice on every component and every topic, but I do want to hit some highlights. So when we look at the components, we'll look at A, to ensure that the unambiguous and primary emphasis and context for each topic described in paragraph 3, that's referring to the legislation, is a message to youth that normalizes the optimal health behavior of avoiding non-marital sexual activity. So again, what does it mean when they use the word unambiguous? If you look up a simple definition of that in the dictionary, it simply means that it's not given to more than one interpretation. And primary emphasis obviously means that we prioritize it. And again, each topic is to be prioritized. So we don't just pick and choose which topics we want to cover or we're comfortable covering. And then of course it gives us the context that we're normalizing. We're trying to create a norm here of avoiding non-marital sexual activity based on that optimal health behavior. And I thought it's very interesting. I know Liz, or Commissioner Darling, talked about it in her opening remarks, the COVID, the pandemic situation that we have. You know, it's amazing how we have created a national norms, right? Of washing our hands and wearing masks and social distancing. And we did it in a very short period of time, but we were all on the same page. There was a national message. And, you know, I used to get on a plane, and if I saw someone with a mask on, I would think, wow, they must be sick, and I'm not sure I want to sit by them. And now it's just the opposite. If I see someone on a plane and they don't have a mask, I'm like, I'm not sure I want to sit by them. So norms can be changed. We can do this. And we need that consistent message across all layers of society that comes through, and we can create an optimal health paradigm shift for our youth. All right, I'll go on. Now, medically accurate and complete. I think we all have a good idea what medical accuracy is, and we know that our medical information must be updated continually and be able to be referenced to peer-reviewed studies from medical and educational and governmental agencies. And when we talk about it being complete, what does that mean? Well, it means we don't have to exaggerate, right, medical facts, and we don't have to emphasize any facts. We just want to give them all the information so they can make informed decisions for the best outcome. And then age appropriate. I know I'm going fast here, but I want to cover all of these. Age appropriateness is extremely important, especially to parents, and especially right now when there are very many controversial articles or ideas and concepts being introduced to younger and younger grades. And so age appropriate is really a conceptual, it's a developmental concept, and it's based on the cognitive development of youth. And we're not taking out a subgroup of the general age group. We're taking the general norm for an age group and what is appropriate for their cognitive development. Very important. And then we're advised also by Congress to base our programs on adolescent learning and development theories. And you know, theories really help us to understand the process of learning. So if you're a program director, I would suggest that, and you're using a particular curriculum, I would make sure that you check with your curriculum provider to see what theoretical frameworks have been used to develop these materials. And it would be great if facilitators could become conversant, with the social learning theory, or social norming theory, or the trans-theoretical model of change. Because what is it going to do? It's going to help them understand how the youth they're serving are processing the information they're giving. So knowing those theories can really be helpful. And then finally, the final component here is a call to be culturally appropriate and recognize the experiences of youth from diverse communities, backgrounds, and experiences. And this is extremely important. And again, I would refer to the whole pandemic situation that our youth across the nation have experienced. It is helpful that before you go into a community or a school district or any kind of community agency, that you get with the gatekeeper and ask the gatekeepers, what are the youth in this area experiencing? How have they fared? Have they lost grandparents or, any loved ones during this pandemic? That's going to impact them. And then also, so if we're going into, say, an area that has a high degree of single parenting, are we making sure that we are commending the often Herculean effort that single parents are making to raise their children? So, and being sensitive to all of that and recognizing and communicating to those students, we want to know, what is your lived experience? And listening intently. I thought the session on predictors, listening for what they're saying, was very, very helpful. So, okay, and we'll continue on to the next slide, and we're going to look at topics now. And, I'm not going to spend, again, the time that needs, we could just spend so much time going very deep on the A through F topics, but this is all about enhancing personal efficacy, right? And personal agency so they can thrive and move into adulthood. So let's now look at the next slide that will delineate the topics. So A, the holistic, individual, and societal benefits associated with personal responsibility, self-regulation, goal setting, healthy decision-making, and focus on the future. There is a lot in there. There is a lot to talk about. All very important. I think we could agree on all of those. There is going to be a session in track 1 on self-regulation alone. I'm only going to key in on goal setting. And the reason for that is I spoke with someone earlier in this month, and they were talking about foster children and how every time they go into a class and they're talking to foster kids, the first thing that they want to know is, what's the plan? What are we doing today? What's going to happen with right now in this hour that you're going to be with us? And she heard that question over enough times to say, there's something about having a plan that helps them feel secure, that it creates a boundary. And I thought that was so insightful, so interesting. And, goal setting, it sounds like, okay, we all know what goal setting is, but let's look at it in a different way, that it could actually be comfort. It could be security for especially trauma-sensitive students, who may are coming from chaos and dysfunctional families and instability and unpredictability. So very, very important that we key on each of those and find a way to be relevant to students. And then B, the advantage of refraining from non-marital sexual activity to improve the future prospects and physical and emotional health of youth. What are we talking about here? We're talking about advantages, right? And here, when we talk about refraining from non-marital sexual activity, we're talking about if you are engaging in non-marital sexual activity, you are entering into an activity without the advantage of a healthy marriage that the typical healthy marriage could afford, like emotional security, physical security, financial security, and commitment, respect. Those things are all really important to both your physical and emotional health. And we never want to be engaging in anything like advantage discrimination. And what do I mean by that? Okay, so what I mean is that somehow we would discriminate against certain subgroups, feeling that that message, of optimal health is not for them. So we want to make sure that we're not discriminating against any youth. This is one of the topics, and this B is for all youth. Actually, all the topics are for all youth. They deserve the best opportunity to have the best information to achieve the best outcome. And then we're going to talk about the increased likelihood of avoiding poverty. And let me just say out of the gate that, poverty is complicated, all right? There's a lot of factors that go into, poverty and cyclical poverty and all of that. But you heard Commissioner Darling talk about the success sequence. And that is also something that is stressed in the legislation for topics, that the simple, formula. And again, this is like a plan. Remember how we talked the goal setting plan that offers security that, hey, maybe I can follow this path and achieve something that I desire to achieve, or escape some types of behavior or environment that I want to escape. And so the success sequence is simple. If a young person graduates from high school and gets some kind of post-secondary education, it doesn't have to be a 4-year degree, gets a full-time job, and then waits till they're 21 and married before having children, they have a very low likelihood of living in poverty. Now, some people have pushed back on that and said, well, that study that came out in 2009 doesn't apply, to all ethnic and racial groups. So in 2017, it's important to know that Brad Wilcox and Wendy Wang also brought in information regarding millennials from low-income backgrounds. And what they found is that 71% of millennials who found or who followed the success sequence, actually, by the time they were 28 to 34 years old, had reached the middle or higher income distribution level. And only 41% of those who did not follow that did. So it's important. There's no silver bullets, but wow, when we can give our young people a roadmap, a plan, it is a good thing. All right, so the next group of topics, we'll go to the next slide. And I know I am talking fast. I hope you're bearing with me here. So the foundational components of healthy relationships and their effect on the formation of healthy marriages and safe and stable families. Now, let me say this, whatever the approach for sex education that people are doing, most people know that healthy relationships, and we agree, are important, right? Everyone knows that we need to build that for a strong, for a thriving, life. And one of the things that sets this particular topic apart, though, however, is that we're encouraging SRAE educators then to broaden that conversation and help young people see the value of building healthy relationships and the impact that will have on the formation of healthy families, marriages, there's a new word, marriages and safe and stable families. So it's just a broader conversation. And then how other youth risk behaviors, such as drugs, alcohol, etc., increase the risk for teen sex. We won't belabor this point. I think we all understand that substance abuse lowers inhibition, it impairs judgment, and that obviously there is more opportunity then for risk behavior. And that's an important point to bring to our youth. And then finally, F, to how to resist and avoid and receive help regarding sexual coercion and dating violence, recognizing that even with consent, teen sex remains a youth risk behavior. So in this era of horrific sex trafficking, this is an extremely important topic. And we want our young people to know, recognize the red flags regarding dating violence and sexual coercion. And they're different. I mean, there's a lot of overlap, but with dating violence, you know, you're typically in a romantic relationship with someone, you know, that you know and that you've consented to be with. And, but with sexual coercion, that is different in that it's typically not a romantic relationship, and it can be between, you know, an adult and a minor, a teacher and a student, and there's usually a power disparity there. So we have to be clear and help our students sort that out, recognize the red flags for both coercion and, of course, violence. And then it's really advisable to have lists of referrals, you know, hotlines, numbers, especially to help young people get the help they need to get out of, you know, a dangerous situation. Now, the last point here on consent, consent is something that we want to always be talking about, but we want to talk about it in the context, in this context, that even if you have consent, so you have 2 ninth graders who have consent, they're consenting to have sex, that still does not mitigate the danger and the risk of teen sex. And the second point about consent that it would be helpful to consider is that in a coercive relationship, the person who has been coerced typically gives consent. You know, it's not something they want to do, but they have been coerced to do it. And when you're talking about consent, you may actually be triggering trauma for that teen. So all that is to say is that there's lots to learn continually, and we would encourage you to continually look at all the topics, all the components, and find out how to be relevant and how to you know, bring real information in you know, to your students so that you're implementing these topics effectively. All right, so the next slide, final slide actually, regarding one of the requirements, if we could see that. This is regarding contraception, and this is pretty straightforward, right? And this is how it reads in the legislation. Any information provided on contraception must be medically accurate and complete, and ensures that students understand that contraception offers physical risk reduction, but not risk elimination. Now, you know, I also want to just add that, you know, the whole myth of safe sex, this is where this is medically inaccurate, you know, to say that you are protected, because what we know that it reduces your risk, but it does not eliminate it. And a lot of young people are very abstract, or they're concrete thinkers. And so they think protection means I'm protected, right? And then finally, you may not in your education provide a demonstration, simulations, or distribute contraceptive devices. So with that, that ends this particular you know, section of the presentation. And Valerie and I both really would like to hear from you And to do that, we'd like to launch a question to start off the questions. And please put your thoughts, your comments in the chat box. But Megan, would you be able to launch the poll question that we have right now? And we'll let that be our kickoff for answering your questions.
Marianne, I'm not seeing that polling functionality working specifically, but if you would like to verbalize it, I can comment it in the chat function and have them respond that way, if that's something we could do.
You know, it may be too much, because really what I was, but maybe not. Maybe this would be great if you could put this in the chat, everyone. The question was, which of the A through F topics do you think that you and perhaps your staff, your facilitators, would benefit for having a deeper look and education on those particular topics? So which one? Would it be poverty, healthy relationships, you know, coercive behavior, consent? So if you could just, you know, use the chat to say, hey, we could really benefit from talking more about poverty in relationship to sexual choices, that would be great. So we can kick it off there. So thank you very much. So we'll look here at the chat and see what we have. Instead of maybe putting D and F, if you could just write it out, healthy relationships, I see poverty, a lot on the healthy relationships and consent.
Megan, I'm wondering if you could put up the handout on the screen. That way people could have a handout.
Oh, that'd be great. That'd be great.
Major to refer to as they ask these questions.
Okay.
There seems to be, you know, healthy relationships and the whole aspect of poverty seem to be winning the race, if we can call it a race. Oh, here's somebody who wants all training on all the topics. There you go. And may I say too that I think that's advisable for anyone to continually look at the topics and refresh, and, you know, look for new information and new studies. Val, do you have a question too that you would like them to answer in the chat?
Yes, actually, I wanted to ask those who were participants, was there anything that was surprising about what prompted Congress to initiate the SRAE program and the things that they looked at? And if there was something surprising, what that might have been. I don't want to confuse it, though, with the answers that are currently being crafted regarding your question.
Poverty as it relates to all of the social determinants of health. Very good comment. Yes, because it's like I said before, poverty is it's a complicated issue, and there are a lot of factors that are really, you know, talking about that. So new content is always good. And Mary Green is reminding us that on the exchange, there are tip sheets on some of the A through F topics, and that would be very helpful to review those, because usually the most updated studies on a particular topic are included. How to impress marriage in areas where marriage is not specifically a norm. You know, that's a very good question, and that's sometimes why people choose to, you know, withhold that information. But, you know, it's like any other factor that impinges on health and well-being. It would be advisable. We don't withhold, you know, information on good nutrition because people aren't eating well, right? We give them the information, the best information for the best outcome.
And just to put a PS on what you just said, Marianne, in addition to the information, then the skills to be able to effectuate that information into personal decision making.
And Val, I see a answer to your question regarding the, how SRAE came about. Linda Doring is saying that they looked at the science and saw that SRAE is the most science-based. Interesting comment.
Yeah, I really think that what was very compelling to those members of Congress that were instrumental in launching the SRAE program was the consideration of how from a public health standpoint, other risk behaviors are addressed, and seeing that there was a disconnect for how a program or a group of programs which have been funded for years and years and years almost exclusively depart from that paradigm. And that was especially disconcerting to them, and they wanted to make sure that was corrected.
Okay, we have put up the required topics there so you can see those. Someone's asking here, where does the cessation model come in? Would you like to answer that, Val?
Sure. Well, it fits very clearly within the optimal health model. If you look at the rings that proceed out from the center green, if a person, let's say, is engaged in high-risk behavior, multiple partners, they would be in that outer ring of red, high risk. So obviously, if they're sexually active, we would want them to move to a lower risk and then eventually to no risk. And that conversation really brings up the opportunity to consider sexual cessation as a health option. So it's very clearly within this. And what's really beautiful about the optimal health model, when I said earlier that Congress saw that it leaves no person behind, that's really, I think, a very encouraging and hopeful piece to this model, in that regardless of the decisions that a young person is currently making, moving toward less risk until hopefully they arrive at a place where they're not engaging in sexual risk at all, is a possibility for anyone. What that path looks like might look different. It's individualized, but it's important to always measure success by going in the direction of less risk and not ending until that person is in the best health, has the best health status possible for that person.
Valerie, I'll let you answer this question also. Any concerns if there is a change in administration for SRAE?
Well, at HHS, there are so many programs. We have 80,000 employees here, believe it or not. And many programs continue without much change in policy at all from administration to administration. However, there are certain programs that we see dramatic changes in priorities and emphasis. And sex education is one of those programs where we see a lot of policy changes based on who's sitting in the White House. I would argue that that shouldn't be the case. Just as we address any other health issue, we should look at health consequences and how to improve the health for that targeted population. And so I would argue that there shouldn't be a change. And at the very least, we should look toward parity between approaches, giving real choice to communities. I'm hoping that that's the case in the years to come. but if the past predicts the future, that won't be the case.
I think that we cannot be deterred, no matter who is in the White House, because it's really our children whose lives are at stake. And if you are not able to get into schools, sometimes we've found other ways, other venues. So I know that there are many people who are on this particular session who are very seasoned, who have given 20, 25 years to implementing curriculum, to learning, continual learning. And it's, I just want you to know, especially as I speak from Ascend, that we esteem what you're doing, that we're here to help. And I want to also just thank Public Strategies for the excellent job that they've done in helping us to be able to communicate with you and give you some of the background, the intent here in this session. So working together, and having that vision of an optimal health and well-being and thriving for all students without regard, to any kind of partisanship should really be our focus. So with that, if there aren't any other questions, and I think we've been given the handout. You can access the handout in the chat also. And want to thank you all for joining us.
Thank you, everyone.